Cabins are supposed to feel like a place to escape from the world, but when you are miles from help, every sound outside starts to feel different. In this video, a woman home alone at 2 a.m. hears someone moving from door to door. A cabin owner catches a tall, dark figure standing near his shed, and one woman's frantic late-night call from her family cabin turns into a mystery that still feels impossible to fully explain. These are some of the most terrifying cabin encounters ever caught on camera. Let's dive straight into the first clip. TikToker Annie Mika was home alone around 2 a.m. when this happened. Someone was moving around the outside of her home, approaching different entry points in the middle of the night. The doors were knocked on repeatedly. The doorbell rang more than once, and whoever was outside did not seem to have any clear reason for being there. That is what makes this clip feel so threatening. It is not one accidental knock. It is not someone briefly coming to the wrong house and leaving. It is the repeated movement around the property, the sense that this person is checking the home, testing the entrances, or trying to get someone inside to respond. And because the area is remote, the situation feels even more dangerous. In a crowded neighborhood, a strange knock might still be scary, but help is close. There are people nearby. There are lights, cars, witnesses. But in a remote place at 2 a.m., that same sound becomes something else entirely. A knock at the door no longer feels like a mistake. It feels like a warning. Inside, Annie remained on high alert, unsure whether the person outside was lost, confused, intoxicated, or something far more dangerous. And that uncertainty is the most frightening part, because from inside the house, there is no way to know what someone wants until they either leave or try to come in. How the situation ended is still unclear, but the footage captures a fear almost anyone can understand. Being alone at night, hearing someone outside your home, and realizing the only thing between you and them is a locked door. But if that was disturbing, the next clip is even harder to ignore. A man began experiencing strange disturbances in his cabin late at night. At first, it was not something he could easily explain. It began with a low vibrating sound, strong enough to wake him from sleep, but whenever he checked the house, everything appeared normal. Nothing had fallen. No appliance seemed to be causing it. No obvious source could be found. Then one night, as he was heading back to bed, something outside caught his attention. The shed door. It was slightly open. Then, slowly, it closed, almost as if something inside had just moved it. Thinking it might be an intruder, he went outside to check. But when he reached the shed, no one was there. The property was quiet again, and the door gave him no answer. Still, the experience bothered him enough that he decided to set up a camera facing the shed. Later, when he reviewed the footage, he saw the same thing happen again. The door opened and closed on its own. No one walked in. No one came out. There was no obvious animal, no person, and no clear explanation. And the low vibrations continued to return at random times, making the entire property feel like something unseen was moving around it at night. Then, one night, when the sound started again, he rushed outside. This time, he saw something. A tall, dark figure standing beside the shed. In that moment, the situation changed completely. It was no longer just a strange sound or a door moving on camera. Whatever had been disturbing the property now appeared to have a shape. Terrified, the man backed away and returned inside. And that is what makes this footage so unsettling. A shed in the dark is already the kind of place your mind does not want to focus on too long. But when the door starts moving by itself, the sound keeps returning, and then a figure appears right beside it. The question becomes much harder to dismiss. Was someone hiding on his property? Was it an animal, a person, or something staged for the camera? Or was there something outside that cabin that never wanted to be seen clearly? Either way, what happens next is maybe even more disturbing. Haley and a group of her friends were staying at an Airbnb together with their moms when they stumbled upon something extremely strange inside the house. While exploring, they noticed a rug placed at the bottom of a staircase. When they moved it, they discovered a hidden door underneath.
And I wanted to open it to see what was down there. So then I got my phone because I wanted to get a video of me going down there to see what was down there because it was actually creepy.
Curious and a little nervous, Haley began recording as they carefully opened the concealed door. Beneath it was a dark cellar hidden below the house. As they looked down into the darkness, something unexpected happened. A woman's voice suddenly shouted up at them from somewhere below, revealing that someone was actually down there.
Who got trapped down there?
Who is this? I don't know. Oh my god, we're so nice. We all need to check out. Okay, we need to
The group later said they had no idea who the person in the cellar was. There's always a chance the owner might be closer than you think. And that's a pretty disturbing thought, but not as disturbing as what you're about to see in this next clip. This horrifying footage was captured by Dustin, a TikToker known for his channel Dustin Lee Frazier, where he usually shares peaceful camping trips in breathtaking locations. But this time, his adventure in Australia turned into something far more sinister. Dustin had booked a small, cozy Airbnb tucked away deep in the woods, with only his 2 loyal dogs for company. He arrived late in the evening, fixed himself a simple dinner in the kitchen, and settled in for what he thought would be a quiet, uneventful night. Sometime after midnight, he was jolted awake by the sharp, restless whining of his dogs. They were alert, tense, focused on something he couldn't see. Then came the sound that made his blood run cold. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing through the wooden floors of the Airbnb. It was unmistakable. Someone was walking through the house. Grabbing a flashlight, Dustin moved cautiously through the darkened rooms, his dogs trailing behind. But each room was empty, every door still locked. Still, the unease lingered. His dogs paced nervously, occasionally staring into empty corners as if watching something he couldn't see. After a thorough search turned up nothing, Dustin returned to bed, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. The peace didn't last. Hours later, the dogs began whining again, more frantic this time. Dustin, determined to get proof, picked up his phone and began recording. Through the dimly lit hallway, the camera captured a figure. A man, motionless, standing in the middle of the corridor, watching him. The figure didn't move, as though hoping Dustin hadn't noticed. But Dustin had. He stepped forward to confront the intruder. That's when the footsteps started again, this time racing toward him. But on camera, there was nothing there. No one. Terrified, Dustin slammed his bedroom door, quickly packed his things, and fled with his dogs into the night. He drove straight to a nearby hotel, locking the door behind him. When morning came, Dustin contacted the local police. They searched the Airbnb from top to bottom, but found no one inside, no forced entry, and no trace of who or what had been there. The officers could offer no explanation. Later, when Dustin reviewed the footage, he adjusted the brightness, and what appeared made his stomach turn. The figure wore a tall hat and a white mask, its features completely hidden. Viewers quickly drew comparisons to the Babadook, a sinister figure from Australian folklore and horror films. The video went viral, leaving thousands unsettled. Dustin and his dogs escaped unharmed, but the police investigation turned up nothing. No suspect, no answers. Just the lingering fear that whatever had stood in that hallway could still be out there. But sometimes, the scariest thing is not inside the cabin. It is waiting outside. On a quiet morning, inside a cabin home in Aspen, TikTok user Aspen Meg noticed movement right in front of the main door and started recording. Sitting just outside was a mountain lion. For a few seconds, it simply remained there, calm and still, close enough that opening the door would have been an extremely dangerous mistake. Then, after observing the area, it slowly rose from its seated position and walked away. That is what makes this clip so intense. There is no mystery that needs to be forced, no ghost story, no blurry figure in the trees. It is a real predator sitting just outside someone's home. And in a cabin or mountain area, that kind of encounter feels different. The home may feel safe, but only because of walls, glass, and locked doors. Outside, the wilderness is still there. It does not stop at the edge of the property. The mountain lion did not attack. It did not even seem aggressive in the footage. But its presence alone was enough to remind viewers how quickly a peaceful morning can turn into something dangerous. Because when a predator is waiting by the door, the cabin does not feel like a home anymore. It feels like a thin barrier between you and the wild. But the next case proves that a locked door does not always make you feel safe. A man named Isaac moved into his family's old home, a secluded property with a long and unsettling history. On the surface, the house looked ordinary, but one place on the property always felt wrong to him: the shed in the backyard. Long before Isaac lived there, the original owner, a war veteran, was said to have suffered from severe PTSD. According to the story, he avoided the shed completely, claiming that something inside it was moving, watching, and waiting. At the time, people may have dismissed it as fear, trauma, or the result of a troubled mind. But years later, Isaac began experiencing the same unease. From his window, he sometimes saw movement inside the shed. At night, he heard banging coming from within. And the longer he lived on the property, the harder it became to ignore the idea that something about that shed felt different from the rest of the house. Then, while recording a video to answer viewers' questions about the property, something happened.
Answer the first question. What happened to the video? Y'all hear that, right? Like that. Y'all see that?
The shed door slowly opened on its own, even though Isaac was alone. It was not violent. It did not burst open dramatically. It moved slowly, almost casually, and somehow that made it feel worse. Because now, the old story did not feel so easy to dismiss. Maybe the original owner had been wrong. Maybe the shed had a simple explanation. Wind, an old latch, shifting wood, or something inside pulling at the door. But after Isaac captured it on camera, one thought became difficult to ignore. What if the man who feared that shed all those years ago had not been imagining things? What if he had been trying to warn everyone about something that was still there? With that question lingering, we move on to this next strange footage. A group of friends went on holiday to a cabin in the woods. During dinner, one of them set up a camera on a timer to take a group photo. When the first attempt did not flash properly, he took a second one. At the time, nobody noticed anything unusual. The group was together, the moment was normal, and nothing about the room seemed alarming. But later, when they looked back at the photos, something stood out. In the first image, right in the center of the table, there appeared to be a figure. It looked almost like a person positioned directly between the group, close enough that it should have been impossible to miss. But according to the people there, it did not match anyone in the cabin. And then, in the second photo, it was gone. That detail is what makes the image unsettling. If the figure had appeared in both photos, it might have been easier to explain. Maybe someone had stepped into the frame. Maybe a shadow or reflection had lined up in a strange way. But when something appears once, right in the middle of the group, and disappears moments later, it leaves the photo feeling wrong. Of course, there could still be normal explanations. A double exposure, a camera glitch, a person moving at the wrong moment, a visual distortion caused by poor lighting. But for the people in that cabin, the photo raised one uncomfortable question. What was sitting with them at the table before any of them realized it was there? Either way, what happened at this next cabin is maybe even harder to explain. TikTok user Guaga Peach shared an unsettling clip after her cat seemed to notice something outside the window late at night. In the darkness, a pair of bright eyes appeared beyond the glass. At first, that could easily be wildlife. Deer, raccoons, owls, possums, and other animals can all create strong eyeshine under the right lighting. In rural areas, especially around cabins, seeing eyes in the dark is not automatically unusual. But the cat's reaction is what makes the footage feel more tense. It stares directly at the window, completely focused. Its body is still, its posture tight, and its ears are facing forward, as if it is locked onto something outside that the people inside cannot hear. Animals notice things before humans do. They hear movement in the grass, sense vibrations, and react to shapes in the dark long before we can make sense of them. So when a cat freezes like that, staring at something outside the window, it becomes difficult not to feel uneasy. Maybe it was just an owl. Maybe it was a raccoon or another animal passing close to the house. But the eyes appear large, the movement feels strange, and for a moment, it looks less like something passing by and more like something watching from the darkness. But what happened next is the reason some people never feel comfortable sleeping in remote cabins. In June 2005, two lifelong friends, David Horse and Frederick Hardesty, traveled to a small cabin in Nahani National Park in the Northwest Territories. They were visiting a friend named Rod Gunderson, and for both men, this kind of trip was not unusual. David and Frederick were experienced outdoorsmen from the nearby community of Fort Simpson. They knew the northern wilderness. They understood the dangers of the area. They were not the kind of people who would wander off carelessly or leave themselves unprepared. But something went terribly wrong. On June 16th, Rod returned to the cabin and noticed something strange. The two men were gone. Inside the cabin, most of their belongings were still there. Food remained stocked. Firewood was stacked nearby. Even their firearms had been left behind. That detail made the disappearance far more disturbing. In a remote wilderness area, experienced outdoorsmen do not normally leave a cabin without essential supplies. and they certainly do not leave behind the things they might need for protection. There were small signs that fires had been burning nearby, but nothing clearly explained where David and Frederick had gone or why they would have left in the first place. Concern quickly spread, and on June 18th, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched a search of the surrounding wilderness. Teams combed through the forest and along the riverbanks near the cabin, but the terrain was vast, rugged, and unforgiving. After several days with no clear result, the official search was called off on June 23rd, leaving family members and volunteers to continue looking on their own. Then, a few days later, the mystery deepened. On June 27th, David Horse's body was discovered about 2.3 miles from the cabin. Investigators reported burns on his hands and arms, and his death was later attributed to hypothermia. But the story did not end there. Nearly 2 weeks later, on July 8th, Frederick Hardisty's body was found floating in the North Nahani River, more than 12 miles from the cabin. That discovery raised even more questions, especially because that stretch of river had reportedly already been searched earlier. Autopsies concluded that Frederick had drowned, but many people close to the men were not convinced that the investigation had uncovered the full truth. Family members and local First Nation communities raised concerns about how the case had been handled. Some witnesses even reported seeing marks in the cabin floor that resembled gunshots, along with damage to clothing that looked like it may have come from a shotgun blast. Those details fueled speculation that something more sinister may have happened before the men died. But no definitive evidence was ever found to prove that theory. To this day, the deaths of David Horse and Frederick Hardisty remain one of the most unsettling mysteries connected to Nahani National Park. Two experienced outdoorsmen vanished from a cabin, left behind the belongings they should have taken, and were later found in places that only made the story harder to explain. And that takes us to this cabin owner who received a motion alert from their surveillance camera in the middle of the night. But when they opened the app, they saw something unsettling moving across the yard. The figure appeared to be shaped like a young woman wearing a white dress. It moved slowly through the property, heading toward the edge of the yard, as if it had no urgency and no concern about being seen. What makes the footage even more unsettling is the way it appears under night vision. The figure looks visible enough to seem human, but not fully solid in the way a normal person should look on camera. It has shape, it has movement, but it also has that strange, washed-out quality that makes it difficult to understand what you are actually seeing. The cabin owner was confused, especially because the home was located in a quiet area with very few visitors. No one had any reason to be walking through the yard at that hour. When they went outside to check, they found nothing. No person, no footprints, no explanation. Maybe it was a real person passing through. Maybe it was a camera artifact, a reflection, a bug close to the lens, or night vision distortion. But if it was a person, that raises an even more uncomfortable question. Who was walking through a remote cabin property in the middle of the night, dressed in white, and why did they vanish before anyone could find them? With that question lingering, we move on to this. Woman who was exploring an abandoned cabin when she decided to take a photo inside the attic. At the time, nothing about the room seemed unusual. It looked like the kind of forgotten space you would expect to find in an old abandoned building. Dark corners, dust, old wood, and objects left behind long after the place had stopped feeling lived in. But later, when she looked back at the image, she noticed something that had not been visible to her in the moment. Near a bench, in the shadows, there appeared to be a faint shape. Not clear enough to immediately identify, but clear enough to make the photo feel wrong. It looked almost like a person sitting there quietly, watching from the corner of the attic. And that is what makes this kind of image so unsettling. When you are inside an abandoned cabin, your eyes are already trying to make sense of the dark. Shadows can look like faces. Old furniture can take on strange shapes. But when something appears in a photo that you are sure you did not see while standing there, it leaves behind a very different feeling. Maybe it was nothing more than pareidolia. Maybe it was a trick of the lighting, the angle, or the old objects in the room. If it was only a trick of the eye, then it was a convincing one, because in that attic, it looked like someone had been sitting there the entire time. But the next one is worse. A Reddit user known as HealthBright555 shared a strange story after their son installed a motion-detecting camera in his bedroom. At first, there was nothing serious about it. It was just something set up for fun, the kind of camera people use out of curiosity, not because they actually expect to capture anything disturbing. But one night, around 1 a.m., the camera picked up movement inside the room. When the family looked back at the footage, they saw what appeared to be a strange figure standing there. It was not a clear, normal-looking person walking through the room. It looked distorted, almost out of place, and at that hour, no one was supposed to be inside. Naturally, the family became concerned. A camera inside a bedroom is already personal enough, but seeing what looks like a figure standing there in the middle of the night makes the entire space feel unsafe. But then the story took a turn. After checking the system, they realized the timestamp might have been wrong. Once the software was updated, the time shifted closer to 8 p.m., which made a much simpler explanation possible. It could have been his sister walking through the room earlier in the evening, captured at the wrong time because of the camera error. That explanation makes sense. It is probably the most logical one. But the reason the clip still unsettled people is because of the first impression it leaves. For a moment, before the update, this looked like a child's bedroom camera had captured someone standing there in the dark when no one should have been inside. And even when a logical answer appears later, that first moment is hard to shake. But this next mystery still has no answer. In October 2019, 47-year-old Adrienne Ada Quintal was staying alone at her family's cabin near Honor, Michigan. In the early hours of October 17, she made a frantic phone call to a friend. It was 2:34 a.m., and during the call, Ada claimed that someone was outside the cabin. She also said that she had fired a gun at them. Alarmed by what she heard, the friend contacted police. But when officers arrived at the remote cabin on Indian Hill Road, they found a scene that only made the situation more confusing. Ada was gone. Her boots and cell phone had been thrown onto the roof of the cabin. Her 9mm handgun was found lying on the ground outside. Investigators also found multiple bullet holes in the cabin's windows and ceiling, but all of the shots appeared to have been fired from inside the cabin. Despite Ada's claim that someone had been outside, there was no blood, no injured intruder, no clear sign that anyone else had been there at all. A massive search began around the wooded property. Tracking dogs, drones, helicopters, and thermal cameras were used to comb through the surrounding forests and swamps. But the terrain around the cabin was thick, flooded, and extremely difficult to search. Days passed, then weeks. Still, there was no sign of Ada. Nearly 10 weeks later, her family decided to search one particularly difficult area again, a swampy beaver pond several hundred yards from the cabin. Using a canoe, they began draining some of the water. And as the water level dropped, something heartbreaking came into view. Ada's body was found submerged in about 3 feet of water, not far from where she had disappeared. Authorities later confirmed her identity through identifying marks, including scars and a tattoo. Investigators stated that no evidence of foul play was found. But even with that conclusion, the strange details from that night continue to make the case hard to forget. Why did Ada believe someone was outside the cabin? Why were her boots and phone on the roof? Why were the shots fired from inside? And how did she end up in a flooded pond so close to the place where the search had started? Whatever happened that night, Ada Quintal's final hours remain deeply unsettling. Not because every detail points to one clear explanation, but because the most important questions still feel unanswered. That's all for today, folks. If you'd like to see more of this creepy content, click on the video on screen.